according to St. Matthew, the 1st chapter. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise the Lord.
Be seated. What's in a name? Or to put it another way, what does a particular name actually mean? And only further complicating matters, there's the added challenge, if not danger, of translating names from one language or culture to another. In 1972, for instance, when Standard Oil of New Jersey, then known as Esso, was looking for a new name, among the finalists were Exxon and Enco. Just before a final decision was made, however, researchers were horrified to discover that Enco was a Japanese term that could mean stalled car. Needless to say, Enco was quickly dropped, and Exxon, of course, ultimately became the corporation's new name. Other companies were not as fortunate, however, at least initially. An example is Mercedes-Benz. When first entering the Chinese market, Benz was somehow translated as Benzi, which means rush to die. Not exactly a good name for a car company. Fortunately, the company quickly corrected this to Benchi, meaning to run quickly as if flying. Not exactly great, but certainly an improvement, I would say. And then there's Coca-Cola. The original Chinese version, KK Kenla, means bite the wax tadpole. Eventually, they weeded through enough Chinese characters to string together a new, at least audibly accurate translation of Koku Kole, which roughly means happiness in the mouth. Much better. Colgate, the company that employed my dad for over 30 years, couldn't do much to change their name, however, since it belonged to their founder, Samuel Colgate. The problem, though, is that in some Central and South American dialects, the word Colgate translates as hang yourself. For it to work, however, you have to pronounce it as Colgate, which, as a point of reference, is basically how Gloria in Modern Family would pronounce it. And although they didn't change their name either, the word Gerber, as the baby food company, also named after their founder, apparently means to vomit in French. Something tells me that their baby food sales are not that great over in France, just saying. Not surprisingly, it also works in the opposite direction as well, that is, from other languages into English. For example, there's a popular candy bar in Poland, which in Polish simply translates as Lucky Bar, but it carries an entirely different meaning in English when read by English speakers, because now it's a, quote, fart bar. Then finally, there's a company from Iran that sells a variety of different consumer goods. One that didn't go over so well, however, was their laundry soap. In Farsi, they call it snow in their marketing campaigns, but a mistranslation had the labels reading barf instead. I'm just guessing that most of us would take a pass on that particular laundry soap, unless, of course, they were marketing it specifically to be used for a particular kind of stain that you wanted to get out of your clothes. What's in a name? Well, as you might have guessed, the very same dynamic is at work for the names of people as well, as I was sharing with the kids just a moment ago. In other words, personal names also have meanings. Picking their child's name, in fact, is one of those things parents-to-be typically spend a considerable amount of time and thought on. A look at the most popular names names in 2018, according to the Social Security Administration, reveals that for girls, it was Emma, followed up by Olivia. The name Emma means universal one, while Olivia is a variation of olive, which means olive tree or olive branch. For boys, the top two names for 2018 were Liam, followed by Noah. My grandson Liam was born in 2018, so his parents, my daughter and son-in-law, were not terribly original in their selection, I guess. Liam, as it turns out, means strong-willed warrior or protector, and is a shortened version of William, which, interestingly enough, came in at number 3 for the most popular boy name last year. Noah, on the other hand, means rest or repose, which refers to a state of rest or sleep or tranquility. In the Bible, names also typically tell us something important about the identity or personality of the individual in question. Adam, the name of the first man in the creation accounts in Genesis, and who, as you may recall, was formed by God from the dust of the ground, means man of the red earth, in part implying a ruddy coloring or complexion, and perhaps also involving a wordplay on the Hebrew word for earth, or Adamah. Eve, on the other hand, means life-giving, which is certainly appropriate given that Eve was, at least in the book of Genesis, the mother of all humankind. And then, of course, there was Abraham and Sarah, first known to us as Abram and Sarah. Abram apparently means exalted ancestor. But when God made a covenant with Abram, promising him that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the seashore, God renamed him Abraham, meaning the father of a multitude. And likewise, Abram's wife Sarai, which means my princess, had her name changed to Sarah, which refers in a broader sense to a lady, princess, or noblewoman, or in a way, the princess, perhaps, thus indicating a move from a specific princess to a global one, again, as befitting her new role as the mother of a multitude. Well, I could go on, but there's one more feature of biblical, especially Old Testament names, that I want to touch on with you this morning. And it has to do with those names that include the letters E-L in them at the end. El, you see, was a Semitic word meaning God or deity, and could refer to any number of Near Eastern gods or deities, including at times the God of the Hebrews as well. And moreover, this reference to God could then be found in the names of individuals. So Daniel, or its female counterpart Danielle, means God is my judge. And Gabriel and Gabrielle mean man or person of God. And likewise, Michael and Michaela refer to one who is like God. And that leads me, in an admittedly roundabout way, to our gospel this morning. And as we heard, today's reading from the Gospel of Matthew opens with the words, "Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way." It then goes on to describe for us exactly how all this came about, culminating in a reinterpretation of an age-old prophecy concerning the birth of a special child. And they shall name him Emmanuel. There's that E-L again. A name, we're told, that means God is with us. Now, it's utterly amazing, breathtaking even, for us to even begin to imagine that God, the ruler of the entire universe, would willingly lower himself and come into our midst, sharing our humanity, our troubles, and our pains. And what's more, that he would do so with all the hoopla and trappings that one might normally expect, and which he unquestionably deserved. Rather, he would come quietly and humbly as a helpless child, born to a couple of poor peasants far from home, and in a backwater, insignificant little village, no less. But that's the miracle of Christmas, isn't it? That Jesus indeed came to be with us. It was Martin Luther himself who once said, "The mystery of the humanity of Christ, that he sank himself into our flesh, is beyond all human understanding." And yet, while we may never truly understand it, as Luther pointed out, we can, however, accept it in faith as a sign of God's unfailing love for us and commitment to us. Speaking of signs, that's how this whole idea of Emmanuel, which again, as we heard, means God with us, all came about in the first place. You see, as Diane Bergen has pointed out, Emmanuel was actually more of a title than a personal name. The name that the angel told Joseph be given to the son who would be born to Mary was Jesus, of course, which simply means Savior. But in telling Joseph this, the angel also referred to that moment in the history of God's people when the title of Emmanuel was first used. As we heard, the angel went on to quote from the prophet Isaiah, in fact, from the very passage that was our first reading this morning. That reading recalls a time when Ahaz was the king of Judah. I don't expect that you remember, but Ahaz was one of those descendants from the royal line of David who was mentioned in the genealogy that opens Matthew's gospel. And here's the deal. Ahaz was king of Judah in the 8th century BC, at a time when his country was being threatened by foreign powers. Ahaz, of course, found himself in a quandary. What should he do? Well, in the midst of this dilemma, God instructed his prophet Isaiah to go and meet Ahaz at a place just outside of Jerusalem where the king was inspecting the city's defenses. Isaiah was told to assure Ahaz that if he only had faith in God, then he had absolutely nothing to fear, nothing to worry about. That's a message that we hear repeated over and over again throughout the Bible, isn't it? Just trust in God, and everything will be all right. Ahaz, however, remained unconvinced. So sometime later, as described for us by that reading in Isaiah 7, the prophet came again and confronted Ahaz at court this time, and now offered him a sign from God in order to convince him to remain faithful. Let it be as deep as the deepest depths or as high as the highest heavens, said Isaiah. But still, Ahaz declined to ask for a sign, even despite this generous offer. Instead, as he piously responded, I will not ask and I will not put the Lord to the test. Now, normally that's the correct response, of course, as Jesus himself later reminded us while being tempted by Satan in the wilderness, do not put the Lord your God to the test. But this was different, you see. Here God was asking him for a sign. Just name it, and I'll do it for you, God seems to be saying here. And so either Ahaz was just being humble and pious and giving the normally correct response. Perhaps Ahaz didn't really have enough faith to trust that God could actually do what he was saying he would do. And Isaiah's response to Ahaz would certainly seem to indicate that this was the case. Because now, obviously exasperated, Isaiah says to him, is it too little for you to weary mortals that you weary my God also? And then Isaiah adds, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. In other words, if you don't ask for one, then God will just go ahead and give you one instead. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. Basically, the very same words that the angel spoke some 700 years later to Joseph in today's gospel. But here's the thing, though. Isaiah didn't necessarily speak those words with Jesus in mind, however, as we normally think. Probably didn't, in fact. After all, the prophet was speaking directly to King Ahaz at the time, and furthermore about a particular historical situation on top of that. Once again, what Isaiah was encouraging Ahaz to do here is to trust God and not in the political power and the military power of his adversaries. And so here Isaiah is assuring the king that a future Emmanuel will grow up in a time of peace, despite the obvious threats currently facing the nation of Judah. In fact, says Isaiah, even before this child is old enough to choose between good and evil, those who you are afraid of will no longer pose any threat to your kingdom. And scholars tell us that this was indeed true, just as Isaiah had predicted. And so who actually was this child to be called Emmanuel? The most obvious answer, of course, is Ahaz's own son, Hezekiah, whose name follows that of his father's in Matthew's genealogy. And scholars further tell us that in stark contrast to the doubting and lack of faith exhibited by his father, Hezekiah was remembered by later generations as an able and vigorous ruler and a pious king. But more importantly, however, this promise from God about a child to be called Emmanuel eventually became a standard for proclaiming a future king and a future time of peace, writes Diane Bergen. It also nourished the people's trust in God, she says. Though they continued to be disappointed in their royal leaders, they never gave up hope that God would someday bring that promise to fulfillment. Fast forward now, in approximately 700 years. And as we heard, that day has finally come. Using the very same words that Isaiah once spoke to Ahaz concerning the birth of his son Hezekiah, the angel now tells Joseph that the child to be born of Mary would in fact be that long-awaited and highly anticipated Emmanuel. And as no other king before him, not even Hezekiah, could possibly claim, this child would truly be God with us. What a promise. What a gift. The true Christmas gift, yet not at all what we or the people of that time, for that matter, would have expected. This king, this Messiah, would turn out to defy every single preconceived notion that God's people had imagined. He wouldn't come as a mighty ruler, but a humble carpenter instead. He wouldn't be born in an opulent palace with every creature comfort at his disposal, but rather in a common, ordinary stable, and among the creatures no less. He wouldn't grow up to defeat their enemies by killing them in battle, but would defeat them instead by being willing to die himself. Of course, quite often there's a difference, sometimes a very big difference, between what we want and what we truly need. And Christmas is a perfect example. What the people of God wanted was a mighty ruler, just like their King David, their beloved King David had been, who would come riding in on a white stallion and kick out the Roman oppressors and restore their kingdom to its glory days, like back when David ruled. But Jesus didn't do that, did he? Instead of giving people what they wanted, he gave them what they truly needed. Instead, he gave them himself. There was indeed no better gift that he could have given them. Jesus was and still is our Emmanuel, God with us. As Scott Hosey writes, God with us in all our flesh and blood realities and messiness. Christ among the pots and pans, as Teresa Avila put it. Christ among the barn animals, and then those quirky magi astrologers, and then all the rest of the Gospel's curious cast of characters. Long ago, there lived in Persia a wise and good king. He loved his people, and he wanted to know how they lived. He wanted to know about their hardships, and so often he dressed in the clothes of a working man or a beggar, and he went to the homes of the poor. No one whom he visited ever suspected that he was their ruler. One time he visited a very poor man who lived in a dark, damp cellar. He ate the coarse food that the man ate, and he spoke cheerful, kind words to him, and then he left. Later he visited that poor man again, and this time revealed his true identity by saying, I am your king. The king naturally thought, of course, that this man would surely ask for some kind of gift or favor in return, but he didn't. Instead, the man said, you left your palace and your glory to visit me in this dark, dreary place. You ate the same coarse food that I ate, and in so doing, you brought gladness to my heart. In the past and to others, you may have given rich gifts, but to me, you've given something even greater. To me, you've given yourself. 2,000 years ago, Jesus immersed himself in the human condition. He took on our human form and lived among us. He represented God's love and commitment and promise, and showed us that what we may see now is not all there is to be. There may be all sorts of things that we want or even think we need this Christmas, but the most important gift of all, the most important gift each and every Christmas, is the gift of God's Son, Jesus, our Emmanuel, God with us. And he has made all the difference. Amen.